Hi, Mike Ackerman here. Artist, filmmaker, historian, and specifically Omaha Beach nerd. You know, that's right. Omaha Beach is a subject I thoroughly study. I've been on Paul Woodage's YouTube channel a couple of times talking about it. Make sure you head over to his channel. And before we talk about The Longest Day, I just wanted to mention that I'm currently running a GoFundMe campaign to help me pay for my very first trip to Normandy this year. I know, I do all this research, I'm, crazy obsessed with this history and stuff, but I've never been able to actually go to Normandy, and I want to change that this year. Of course, I'll be documenting the whole thing, doing videos about it and showing all of my research and stuff like that. So if you want to see that, please follow the link below and help send me to Normandy this year. I really appreciate it. So now let's take a look at Hollywood versus history. When reviewing a World War II movie that was made in the 50s or 60s, is it fair to point out all of the blatant inaccuracies that are so obvious to contemporary historians? Like, come on, the internet didn't exist back then, there weren't nearly as many books written on it as there are today. The whole trend about collecting World War II vehicles and rebuilding them didn't really take off until the 90s, and the same can be said for a lot of the uniforms and gear as well. So is it fair to say things like, well, all of the German tanks in the movie The Battle of the Bulge, they're all M47 Patton tanks instead of German Tigers or Panthers. Or let's say all of the Luftwaffe soldiers in The Great Escape, they look terrible, their collar insignias make no sense. As a viewing experience, that can be annoying as hell. But for history's sake, yes, it is absolutely fair to point that stuff out, and that's why we're here. We're going to be taking a look at the very first movie depiction of Omaha Beach ever, from the 1962 movie The Longest Day. And since it was made in 1962, you better believe it has inaccuracies. But I'm not doing this as a way to hate on this movie. In fact, I don't hate this movie at all, For 1962, I think it's actually a pretty good World War II film to compare to a lot of other things from this time period. This is really just to compare the actual events of history to what's in the movie and to learn from that. So consider this more of an educational video rather than, a movie review, even though it is a movie review, so whatever. Also, I'm only taking a look at the Omaha Beach scenes in this movie. I know that Point to Hawk was technically within the Omaha sector, but the Point to Hawk scene in this movie could be its own video, and, this is already going to be long as hell anyway. So we're just going to be doing the Omaha Beach scenes in the movie. So let's take a look at a 1962 depiction of the Battle of Omaha Beach. Been a while since I've seen this.
Riskieren wir noch mal einen Blick. Nichts. Nicht mal Mühe, uns zu sehen.
It's the oh shit moment.
Invasion. Sie kommen.
Alarm! Oberstleutnant, die Invasion ist da! 5000 Schiffe da! Da draußen müssen an die 5000 Schiffe sein!
I don't mean to come out swinging with the tiny, minute details, but if you look closely on Plutskat's binoculars, you can see "Made in Germany" written in English on them. What is that? What? That's so bizarre. So obviously, this movie is based on the book The Longest Day that was written by Cornelius Ryan. And Cornelius Ryan actually wrote the screenplay for this movie, which is a bit interesting. What they're showing here actually has to do with what Werner Plutskat told Ryan back in 1958 when he interviewed him. This guy right here, he's meant to be Werner Plutskat, and he was the commander of the 1st Battalion of the 352nd Artillery Regiment of the 352nd Infantry Division, which had its inland gun batteries all sited along Omaha Beach. According to Werner Pluskat, around 1 a.m. or so in the morning, he was called to his observation bunker at WN 59 along the coast, where he observed the channel throughout the night until spotting the Allied fleet. And he said that he was the very first German to spot the Allied fleet that morning. I say according to because, like pretty much almost all German accounts when it comes to Omaha Beach. There are conflicting testimonies and not a lot of solid evidence to back this up. For example, according to Heinrich Severlo, who was a German soldier of the 352nd Artillery Regiment at WN 62 at Omaha Beach, he claims that Werner Plutzkat was actually in a whorehouse on the night of D-Day. He was off in a brothel somewhere and wasn't at his observation bunker at all. That's what he claims. But that's a very bold thing for Severlo to say, because Severlo's own testimony, again, just like other German testimonies, it's not very reliable, conflicting statements and such, and highly questionable. So Werner Plutzkat said he was at his observation bunker. Heinrich Severlo says he wasn't. Who are we really to believe here? I can honestly lean both ways. It's Plutzkat was the battalion commander, and that would have been his job to go to his observation bunker that morning when they were getting these kind of reports. However, the fact that he told the story to Cornelius Ryan with the notion that he was the very first German to spot the Allied fleet that morning, and it was a statement he would repeat, for a long time. It does make me think that he was, seeking some kind of celebrity status. It does kind of reek of that.
Hier an dieser Stelle habe ich vor 20 Jahren als erster deutscher Offizier die erste Meldung von einem Aufmarsch der alliierten Flotte gemacht. Mein Regimentskommandeur meldete sofort diese Situation der Division weiter. Die Division rief mich an und fragte: Plutzkat, was ist hier los? Sie sagen, es sind so viele Kriegsschiffe, da stimmt das? Da habe ich gesagt: ja, meine Herren, hier ist was los. 5.000, 6.000 Kriegsschiffe hier auf dem Meer. Wenn ihr mir nicht glaubt, kommt selber her und seht euch das an.
And labeling yourself as like the very first German to see the Allied fleet, I mean, it's a really bold claim to make, especially with how many people were along that, coast observing that morning. I mean, Walter Amsen, who was the commander of the Crispik battery that was right behind Utah Beach, he's also credited as being the very first one to spot the Allied fleet that morning. However, the 352nd Division's log in Bayeux claims that the very first report of Allied ships being spotted came at around 5:02 a.m. That's noted in their log, 5:02 a.m. And that is right around the exact same time that Walter Amsen phoned headquarters in Cherbourg and made his report that he also spotted the Allied fleet. So there's just not enough solid evidence to prove that Plutzkat was the very first German to spot the Allied fleet. But according to him, he was, and that's what Ryan put in his book. Now, in terms of Plutzkat's observation bunker here in the movie, they use the intact 2-story fire control bunker at Langes-sur-Mer in Normandy for this. That's an actual German M262A Leitstand, which was the fire control bunker for those 15-inch guns that are in those casemates along Langes-sur-Mer. If you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. Going back to Walter Amsen, he was actually in an observation bunker that was kind of similar to this, not exactly the same, but it would have been the same kind of thing, and that's because he was commanding a naval coastal battery, and that's what Langes-sur-Mer was. It was a naval coastal battery. The thing is, though, Plutzkat was the commander of army batteries scattered inland, not Kriegsmarine naval batteries. In reality, Plutzkat's observation bunker at WN 59, which was on the very far eastern shoulder of Omaha Beach, it would have been nowhere near as large as the Langes-sur-Mer Leitstand. It would have been a very small little concrete room buried in the escarpment and camouflaged. All around Omaha Beach, every few German nests had one of these observation and fire control bunkers for the inland batteries. They were not big at all. They were very small. They were just a box, basically, sitting on the edge of the escarpments. So no, for anybody visiting the famous sites along Normandy, which I myself have not been able to do yet, Plutzkat's observation bunker was not the Leitstand that's at Langes-sur-Mer that many tourists go to today. And I guess as a way to represent Plutzkat's 352nd Artillery Regiment, they placed clusters of big guns all around the Leitstand, which they would not do. That looks like a British 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun. I guess maybe to represent a German Flak 30. The other one looks like it could maybe be a Pak 40 anti-tank gun. I don't know. Another funny thing about this is that this is supposedly the moment that the Allied fleet was spotted, so, around 5 in the morning. But it just looks like broad daylight, sun's shining on the water. I get it, man, they have to be able to see what's in the movie, they have to show the audience what's in the movie. But in reality, it would still be dark at this time. Okay, those look like... I'm not much of an aviation guy at all. Those planes look like A-1 Sky Raiders, which weren't introduced until after the war. So I would think for D-Day, P-47 Thunderbolts would probably be more accurate, but I'm not an aviation guy, so I can't say for certain on that one. If you know, please let me know in the comments.
General, in exactly 2 minutes, the fleet will open fire.
So then we go to U.S. General Omar Bradley here, who's the commander of the U.S. First Army. And the ship they initially show is a guided missile cruiser from the 1950s. Like a lot of war movies of this time, they would integrate a lot of U.S. military training footage into the movie as a way to, depict bigger things like this. So the A-1 Sky Raider is mixed in with the 50s guided missile cruiser. That's a dead giveaway that this is some training exercise footage that they were able to get and put it in the movie. It's a thing that happened back then. I get it, but it's inaccurate. So Omar Bradley was actually aboard the USS Augusta on D-Day, and this shot of him right here in the movie is based on a photo taken on June 8th that shows Bradley with a bunch of naval commanders and stuff aboard the Augusta.
Le voilà, comme d'habitude. Toujours à l'heure.
Here's his oh shit moment. Oh, topple off this horse here. Oh shit! Oh no! Okay, there's a lot to say about this. So this famous scene with the fat German on horseback and the elated old Frenchman is sort of based on actual events, but again, this is all stuff that's from Cornelius Ryan's book. And Cornelius Ryan, he was, a journalist. He wasn't really a historian, so everything in Cornelius Ryan's book is not completely accurate. It's not 100% true. There's a lot of embellishment in it, and there's a lot of just straight up made up stuff. And, he was a journalist, but even a number of historians have done that over time. Interestingly, this scene right here was filmed at the St. Honorine Draw, which is the actual location of Major Werner Bruscat's observation bunker at WN-59. It was on the opposite side of that draw right there from this house, and that house is still there today. But this old Frenchman right here is meant to represent Michel Hadelet, who was a veteran of the Armée de l'Air and fought during the Battle of France in 1940. And he was also a resident of Vieuville-sur-Mer, which is the westernmost village of Omaha Beach. Right away, the big issue here is that the guy in the movie is an old man. You can tell he's an old guy. The real Michel Hadelet was only 31 years old on D-Day in 1944. But hey, Old farts portraying real-life guys who were in their 20s and 30s in 1944 is a running thing throughout The Longest Day, so I guess I'm not too surprised by that. But because Michel Hardelet is depicted here as an old man, when I first saw this movie when I was younger, I just assumed that this lady here was his wife. But in reality, Michel Hardelet lived with his mother. She was only in her 50s at the time. Michel Hardelet and his mother originally owned a large seaside house called Les Hortensias, or the Hydrangeas, that was eventually requisitioned by the Germans, and then the Hardelets were eventually forced to move into a house back in Vieilleville. From his house in Vieilleville, Michel had a good view of the channel, and as well as the Vieilleville descent on his left, the German nest WN-71 straight ahead, and then the nest WN-70 on his right. Actually, I should just stop right here and let Michel Hardelet say what he actually saw that morning when he spotted the fleet, because he actually did write out his own testimony after The Longest Day came out. I obtained this from a contact in Vieilleville-sur-Mer, and then I had to have it translated to English because it's only in French. Shout out to my friend Tom Bernard for helping with that a couple of years ago. Keep in mind, this is a translation, so some of it might sound a little bit awkward. I had to reword a couple things in order for them to make sense in English, so just keep that in mind. But I'm going to read to you this testimony written by Michel Hardelet documenting what he said he saw that morning. First, though, I'm going to give his thoughts that he put down on the book and the movie, so here we go. When Cornelius Ryan came to see me, accompanied by an interpreter, to collect an anecdote for the historical novel he was about to write in 1959, he took some notes after hearing the interpreter's translations. Was this translation accurate? Did Ryan mention all the details? Did he even reread them? In any case, his text does not correspond in some respects to what I told him. As far as I am concerned, only my age is correct. According to his book, I was a lawyer who also had a brother and a niece, none of which are true. He states I heard the cryptic radio broadcast that morning, which I did not, since all the inhabitants had to leave their radios at the town hall. Finally, the German riding a horse to the beach that he says I saw every morning is misinterpreted. Daryl Zanuck, inspired by Ryan for his 1962 film The Longest Day, didn't even bother to get my age right. I was 31 in 1944, and my mother was 54. Ferdinand Ledoux, the actor who played me, was 65 years old, and Pauline Carton, who played my mother, was 78, giving a gap of 34 years for me and 24 years for my mother. And yet, a film team visited me to take notes about my height and build. As for the scene of the German on a horse and the naval shelling, Zanuck combined the grotesque with the ridiculous. This is the truth. I was awakened around 3 a.m. by the sound of rapidly expanding aircraft engines. By the time I reached the window and heard a whistling sound, I could see the glow of 5 or 6 bombs exploding on the cliff face by my mother's field, 35 meters from our house. Anticipating the consequences of what was to come, I got fully dressed, told my mother and the maid who had been awakened by the explosions to do the same, and went to my window every quarter of an hour. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. Suddenly, a curtain of mist parted on the horizon, revealing thousands of ships, a superb, grandiose sight. I shouted to my mother, "Look at the sea!" And as I passed my bedroom window, I saw my neighbor coming out of his house, and I shouted to him, "It's the landing! Go to the sea and admire it!" He went into the vegetable garden behind his house, accompanied by his wife. We were all stunned at the sight before us when a cart pulled by a speedy Norman trotter arrived, driven by a German non-commissioned officer. He passed the grocer's shop, followed the Rue des Hamel à Patray for 50 meters, and turned left into the meadow where the breach in the barbed wire fence was located. It is true that a certain soldier always brought cans of juice to the men at their posts at the same time every day, but that morning this was not the same German. He was bareheaded, with his tunic open and his shirt billowing above his breeches. He seemed to me to be from the 352nd Division's company stationed in the area and had been ordered to go to the Vieilleville cliffs and report what he saw. At this point, the non-commissioned officer stood up, spotted the fleet, jumped off the cart, and sprinted towards the post. As for the horse, he turned around and trotted back to his stable with the cart behind him. Sensing that the shots were going to start due to the proximity of the boats, my mother took her jewelry and money and we headed for the shelter in our garden. Before going down to join her, I placed 10 bundles of wood over the top. As soon as I went into the shelter, the naval fire started. It was a little after 5:30 a.m. British time. And the bombs exploding on the cliff next to WN-71 that Michel describes were from the bomber planes that morning, not the naval bombardment. But in the movie, the naval bombardment is the only part of it we see. Both the naval bombardment and the air bombardment missed all their targets, by the way, or almost all of them. Michel did not wait around to see the naval gunfire that morning because he wisely chose to head to his shelter once he realized what was about to happen. I mean, this was about to turn into a war zone. You know, even if these French civilians were, happy that the Allied invasion had finally come, it still meant that this was about to be a war zone. This whole area was about to become a war zone. So when it comes to Omaha Beach civilian testimonies that I've read and listened to, they always say that the first thing they did was they went to their shelters, which were commonly dug in their backyards. That, or they went into their cellars, if they had cellars. They would immediately shelter themselves because they knew that this was a war zone. I get what they're doing here with this patriotic stuff, but I am really not a fan of it. During these bombardments, these civilians would be terrified. I mean, they'd be terrified all day. It's freaking war zone outside. They wouldn't be hopping around with waving flags, jumping, celebrating, cheering while 5-inch naval shells explode all around them. As Michel Hardelet said, it's grotesque and ridiculous. And in my opinion, it really undermines the danger that these people faced that day. So, get some more shots of the Longe-sur-Mer battery that they use for Plousquet's battery here. Another line of unidentifiable anti-tank guns. On the far right, we have an American 50 caliber Browning M2 quad mount loaded with Tombstone magazines. I guess that's maybe meant to represent like a German Flakweiler 38. I don't know. Although for the Atlantic Wall, when it comes to like AA guns and such, the type of AA guns you would see would be the Zwillingsackel 36, which is a twin MG34 setup. You can find tons of photos of those things along the Normandy coast, including Omaha Beach. A really neat thing about this shot right here, though, is that because this scene was filmed at the Longe-sur-Mer battery in Normandy, if we look way in the background, we can see a harbor. That's the harbor of Port-en-Besson. And then above that is the actual Omaha Beach right there on the horizon. So yeah, all of the stuff we see in it, that's where all that shit really happened. It's just right there in the shot. So kind of cool. 6:32 hours. Interesting. Old school green screen shot type thing there. Very close to each other. Alright, we're getting some text that says 0632 hours, which was the scheduled time for the very first wave at Omaha Beach. Actually, it was 6:30, 0630. I don't know why it's off by 2 minutes here, but whatever. Then we get this montage of, the Americans getting ready on their landing crafts and such. They would have actually started gearing up around 3 a.m., so still in pitch blackness, they would have started gearing up, at 3 in the morning. And then they would have started loading onto their landing crafts between like 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. And then their boats would have left their motherships and formed these like circles, these assembly circles, and they would have done that until it was time to finally go to the beach. We see some interesting stuff here in this montage. The guys going down the cargo nets into the LCVPs, or the Higgins boats, already sitting down in the water. That was a common way to load onto those things. Another way of doing it, though, was called rail loading, and that's where the landing craft would actually still be fastened to the ships, and everyone would pile inside, and then it would be lowered down into the water. It's kind of hard to make out some of the details in the uniforms and the gear, but I'm guessing this was another case where they used actual military assets. Perhaps a lot of these extras were actual soldiers who were dressed in, some modern gear and maybe like a cross between some World War II gear. I can't really tell. What I can see, though, are that there are a number of black guys within these units, and that would not have been a thing. The only black soldiers you would have actually seen on Omaha Beach on D-Day would have been guys from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. You know, those are guys who were tasked with setting up those big barrage balloons. They look kind of like blimps. You see them hovering over the beach, you know, over beach exits and over bunkers, and a lot of photos taken after D-Day. It was their job to set up those things, and they actually would have been on the beach on D-Day. I mean, you could have maybe like, you know, guys on the decks, you know, some black soldiers on the decks of these ships while everyone's loading onto the landing craft amongst some of the white guys, but once it got to the actual units themselves, no, there would not be black guys mixed in with the white soldiers. Something else that I notice is that, you know, we see a lot of these LCVPs and LCMs as well in this sequence, and the LCVPs, they're all marked PA-44. Well, that's the classification for the USS Fremont. The Fremont was an attack transport that was used towards the end of World War II in the Pacific Theater. It was used all the way up until 1969, so that's why, you know, we can see the ship being used in this scene. That's the ship they used for the movie, obviously. So, of course, the numbers on the landing craft are going to be the numbers of the Fremont, but that's not accurate, so... In this green screen shot right here, or composite shot, you know, it's 1962, that big ship in the footage behind them, that's called an LSD. Yeah, I know, right? LSD, haha. It stands for Landing Ship Dock, and that was not used in Europe at all. That was solely a Pacific thing during World War II. The LCVP Higgins boats, you know, they're way too close to each other. Also, look how sunny it is, you know? I mean, the sun is just shining down on them. This looks more like the Dragoon landings of southern France that would have happened 2 months after the events of this movie.
Nein, bringen Sie selbst. Sagen Sie, unsere Verbindungen sind gestört. Die Leitungen sind durchschnitten. Meine Herren, bitte.
You know, for the time period this movie came out, I do think this is actually a fairly good depiction of the German perspective. I like how not everyone is like a bumbling moron, you know, or a fanatical cartoon villain. And, you know, that's rare to see in American war movies of this time period. And also, they're actually speaking German. That's also something you don't see from this time. My only criticism, though, is that with the German perspective in this movie, it's solely focused on the commanders. That's one thing I've always noticed about this movie. It's solely focused on what's going on behind enemy lines. We never have a German character actually in battle in this movie. I mean, Pluscat's kind of the closest we get to it, but there's never a perspective of what's going on the front lines. But, you know, we have that for the Americans, the British, but we don't have that for the German perspective. It's all like from their offices. Whoa. Now that's impressive. Oh, nice stock footage.
There it is, men. Omaha Beach, dead ahead.
Stand by!
Achtung! Feuer!
Going up a little too soon for the very first guys to hit. Tanks up there.
Then over the beach. Let's go.
Oh, there's the shadow of the camera. Screw it, we're not setting this up again. Took us 20 hours to set up the shot, and we're gonna roll with it. Hey man, I get it. Alright. So yeah, let's talk about some of the stuff we saw there. This is such a rudimentary depiction of Omaha Beach that it's difficult for me to know where to begin. This is really like the first time in the movie that we see the Germans, well, at least for the Omaha Beach scenes, that is. And if I'm going to comment on their uniforms and gear, I mean, it looks like your typical Hollywood German from that time period, you know, all wearing M36 tunics with the dark collars and shoulder straps. They're wearing ill-fitting, shiny helmets, all wearing black marching boots, you know, not a whole lot of gear being used at all. I noticed that during the bombardment scene, Unteroffizier Fatso, aka Goldfinger, he had on the pre-war pointed shoulder straps rather than the rounded ones. It should mainly be a mishmash of M40 and M42 and M43 uniforms, but they would also be wearing their HBT uniforms. A lot of these guys, they'd be wearing those summer HBT uniforms. They're much lighter, and you saw those along the coast a lot. It also wouldn't be uncommon for some of these guys to be wearing their HBT Drillick uniforms. You know, they wore those for work detail. For example, Franz Gockel of Grenadier Regiment 726 of Company 3, he was at WN 62, which overlooked the eastern side of Omaha Beach. He wrote in his memoir that he was actually wearing his Drillick uniform on D-Day, the entire day, because he had planned to dig trenches that day. He mentions that his wool uniform was back in his barracks. So you could see a lot of that as well. And if I want to get even more pedantic, some of the guys along the Atlantic Wall would also be wearing like repurposed Reichswehr tunics. You see some of that in photographs. And also a lot of guys would be wearing retailored Dutch tunics, you know, that would be retailored to have Litzen, German Litzen on them and stuff like that. Now, for a movie from 1962, I would definitely not expect that to be the case. I would not expect them to go to that level of detail. That is some super nerd level detail. But if you're into World War II history, there's an extra fact for you. Now, regarding the weapons, we see a number of MG42 machine guns getting set up, you know, which is pretty typical for a war film of this time. The abundance of MG42s at Omaha Beach, you know, that's another common misconception. The MG34 would have actually been a more common machine gun. Interestingly, though, we do see on the far left here a water-cooled machine gun getting set up. That's actually not unrealistic. You actually see in a lot of photographs a lot of old machine guns, you know, water-cooled machine guns being put into service along the Atlantic Wall. One typical thing that we get in this is that while these guys are running to their positions, we have an alarm going off, like, you know, I've seen that depicted in a lot of D-Day media, especially video games. But I've never found any evidence or testimonies from anybody that ever mentions like an electric alarm or siren going off to alert guys to their positions. German testimonies usually state something like an alarm was raised, but that's just referring to their alert status. You know, that doesn't actually mean an electric alarm or siren was going off like it was an air raid. When it came to these guys actually being ordered to their positions, they just said that, you know, their NCO would show up at their barracks and yell at them to get ready. That was it. The geography, the whole layout of the beach, yeah, it looked nothing like that. For the defenses, the very first thing that sticks out to me is this gargantuan concrete wall along the escarpment. I guess this is meant to be like an anti-tank wall, even though it's got its own like shelf on the inland side, so guys can actually stand on it like it's a parapet. It's a complete fantasy, you know. The Germans had nothing like that along Omaha Beach, or really anywhere along the Atlantic Wall. The only thing I can sort of compare it to would be some of the anti-tank walls that were built around parts of Pas-de-Calais, and there's only one I can really think of that had like a parapet type thing that guys could actually stand on like that. But it's still way bigger than anything the Germans had when it came to anti-tank walls along the coast. What is kind of neat though is that we do see a French tank turret integrated into a fortification, you know, that's called a Panzerdreturm, and that was a real thing, you know. After the fall of France in 1940, the Germans needed armaments for their Atlantic Wall, and old captured French tank turrets were a good solution for that. But if I'm going to be a pedantic dick again, which I will be for history's sake, the correct Panzerdreturm fortifications for Normandy would have mainly been APX-R turrets from French Renault R35 light tanks. And what we see in the movie here, though, is an APX-4 turret from a French Chabi 1 tank. And the APX-4 turrets were mainly used in Brittany rather than Normandy. So it's the right concept, but the wrong location to use that kind of turret. But it is the only time, I think, in any movie I've actually seen a Panzerdreturm fortification. So that in itself is really cool. The trench is far too wide. It's not zigzagging like it should be. It's lined with your typical sandbags. I've never found any evidence of Germans using sandbags along Omaha Beach. There are no dug-in positions for machine guns or mortars. They're just sitting out in the middle of the battle trench. You know, everyone is way too close to each other. I mean, if a grenade fell in here, like, you'd have about 10 dead guys in a second because everyone is just clustered right next to each other. And there's no, you know, corners to anything. It's all just one big straight line. The mortars, which are just American M1 mortars, by the way, instead of the German Granatwerfer 34s that they should be in their own dug-in positions, you know, apart from the trenches. Or they should be in fortified Tobruk positions, a concrete position. And to top it all off, the beach is way too short for H-hour. It would be much wider than that. The German obstacles are just scattered all over the place, which is pretty typical for Omaha Beach depiction, instead of having them in 2 rows, which is how they actually would have been. I don't see any quintet obstacles along the shore, but I do like that they have included the Minenpfahl posts, you know, the stakes with the mines on them. Those were there, and those usually get neglected in depictions of Omaha Beach, so that's a plus. So the German stuff is pretty bad, of course, but what about the American stuff? So this is supposed to be the very first boats in the first wave hitting Omaha Beach, so that would mean that this is likely the western end, like Charlie Sector and Dog Sector. The point is that if these are supposed to be the very first boats in the first wave that hit the western end of Omaha Beach, then they should be the British LCAs rather than the American LCVPs. A lot of Americans came across the channel aboard British Royal Navy ships, so a lot of their little boats that they were in, their, you know, landing crafts, were British LCAs crewed by the Royal Navy, especially in the first waves. The GIs themselves, well, kind of like the Germans, they're just like your basic World War II costumes that you saw in a lot of these war movies back then. They should all have their helmets buckled, most definitely, but as was popular in movies back then, they just have them loose, dangling around. From what I can see, Robert Mitchum and Eddie Albert are the only ones wearing the M41 jackets. Everyone else seems to be wearing the M43 jacket, and they all look very dark because they're OD green. That should not be the case. Everyone should have the M41 khaki jacket. The only kind of pack I'm seeing on these guys is the M1928 pack, and that's accurate, but what I'm noticing is that a lot of these guys, their packs are just flat as a pancake, you know? They're completely flat. They have nothing inside them. They just pulled them out of a stack and threw them on the extras. No, these things, they should have stuff inside them. They wouldn't be flat. Of course, I don't see any, you know, standard invasion equipment that you would see on these guys. No ass jack vests, no, you know, pilo film bags for their rifles, no condoms on the barrels of any rifles. No one has any scrim on their helmet. I saw that the actor Eddie Albert was the only one wearing a Navy life belt, but when they're coming off these boats, everyone should have those life belts on. And then there are some more anachronisms that are pretty typical of the 1960s war films. You know, you got the 1945 bayonet lug on the M1 carbines. You know, that's something that you see in a lot of war films back then. That wouldn't be the case in 1944. And then you see, you know, the big M20 super bazooka being used. I see that thing pop up in all kinds of movies in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They're supposed to be in World War II. You know, I get it. It was common. It was a weapon that was, you know, being used at the time, but that thing wasn't finished until late 1945. It never saw use in World War II. So for demolition teams coming off of Omaha Beach, their bazookas should be, you know, like the M1 or the M1A1 variants. Again, I'm seeing a lot of black soldiers mixed in with the white ones. This is not Korea or Vietnam, man. You know, this is World War II. African-American soldiers would have been segregated to all African-American units back then. You know, Executive Order 9981 didn't happen until 1948. In this huge wide shot, we do see that in the upper right corner, there are some tanks in the background. That's accurate. You know, there would have been tanks landing on Dog Green and Dog White sector from the 743rd Tank Battalion in the first wave. So that is accurate. Now, I bet you $1 million that those are simply plywood flats that are set up way the hell back there on the beach. And there's no problem with that. That's not what I have a problem with. The problem is that they're actually Pershing tanks. You can see the outline of them. They're actually Pershing tanks, but they should be Sherman tanks instead. That's my only real complaint with it. Other than that, you know, it's an old school effect that still holds up today. What does not hold up, though, is some of the acting by the extras, in my opinion. Again, I know this is a product of its time, but sometimes I just cannot get past how they depicted death in movies back then. I mean, this guy in the water right here, he's just looking at the camera, like, waving his arms. Like, what are you doing? What is that? Is that how people react when they get shot? It looks so stupid. Hey, look at that! Look at that! There's like a flame, like spurting out of the APX-4 turret up there on the wall to simulate a muzzle flash. That's kind of neat. My guess is that's like some kind of maybe gas-powered effect to get that fire to come out, but in reality it would be like a bang, you know. The rate of fire is like a semi-automatic, it seems. You know, it's kind of ridiculous, but a neat little effect, you know. At least they did something rather than just have it sit there.
Hello, General, sir.
Are you all right, boy?
Yes, sir.
Well, don't you think you better go back there and get your rifle?
Out there, sir?
You're almost sure to need it before this day is over.
Yes, sir.
Now, a lot of you watching this probably already know, but Robert Mitchum, the actor here, he's supposed to be Brigadier General Norman Cota, who was the assistant commander of the 29th Division on D-Day. Norman Cota was 51 years old when he landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and Cornelius Ryan's book, as well as this movie, were the start of all of these quotes and stories surrounding what Cota did on Omaha Beach. When Cornelius Ryan was writing the book, he had this like questionnaire kind of thing that he was sending out to all of these veterans, and Norman Cota was one of the guys who got one, so he filled it out and sent it back to him. But then eventually Cota sat down to do an interview with Cornelius Ryan. It's kind of interesting though, Cota is hardly mentioned in Cornelius Ryan's book. I think he's only mentioned in 3 pages. There are only 3 pages that have his name on there, but he's become the one of the main characters of The Longest Day. So he became one of the main characters of the movie here. So Robert Mitchum's character, Norman Cota, he was a real guy. He is based on a real person. But he is the only real person depicted during the Omaha Beach scene. Eddie Albert plays a colonel in the movie who Robert Mitchum just refers to as Tom. He's completely fictional, but I think he might be based on Colonel Charles Canham, who was the commander of the 116th Infantry Regiment, and he actually did land with Cota on Omaha Beach, pretty much just like how Eddie Albert is with Robert Mitchum in this scene. Now, another weird thing, though, is that Canham is mentioned in the book. I don't know, maybe Canham was threatening to sue 20th Century Fox if they used his name. I don't know. I don't know why they had to change his name to Tom in the movie. Cota's aide-de-camp on D-Day was 24-year-old Jack Shea, and he was with Cota the entire time on Omaha Beach. Now, Shea is not mentioned at all in Cornelius Ryan's book, but he is briefly mentioned in the notes that Ryan took while he was doing an interview with Norman Cota, where he actually misspells his name. So, obviously, Ryan did not track down Jack Shea to do an interview. But one thing I did notice in the movie is that Robert Mitchum is followed around by this guy with Captain Bars on his helmet, and I don't think they ever say his name at any point, but maybe that guy is meant to represent Jack Shea? Who knows? Jack Shea eventually did write everything down he experienced on Omaha Beach. He wrote it down in a very detailed document that was written in November 1944, so pretty fresh when it comes to memory, and that document has become pretty much the best source of what happened with Norman Cota on Omaha Beach. The document has been a big source for books like Joe Balkowski's Omaha Beach book and Noel Mello's book, D-Day General, which is about Norman Cota. Unfortunately, Cornelius Ryan never came upon Jack Shea's very detailed document when he was writing The Longest Day. So the genesis of Norman Cota is a bit misinterpreted and vague. For example, Norman Cota's boat, which was LCVP-71, which came from the USS Charles Carroll, that's right, it was not one of those larger LCMs that we see in the movie, that came to Omaha Beach around 07:30 in the morning in the second wave, not the very first wave like what we see in the movie here. So all the initial carnage that we see, you know, when these guys are landing, that would have been already going on for about an hour before Cota and Canham even came ashore.
General, first reports from Omaha, sir. Assault teams have landed. No direct radio contact, but destroyers report first and second waves appear to be pinned down on the beach. Concentrated artillery and mortar fire. Third wave floundering. Heavy casualties, sir.
Okay, so we jump ahead a bit here. You know, like I said, the first wave would have landed between 0636 and 0700, and then the second wave would have landed between 0700 and 0800. Because of the carnage and the lack of advancement that was going on the beach, the beachmasters of the 6th and 7th Naval Beach Battalions actually ordered that no more landings take place after that. So for a few hours, no more boats were landing at all on Omaha Beach. This guy right here comes up and tells Omar Bradley that the third wave is floundering, like they're struggling to get out of the water, I guess. Well, the third wave consisted mostly of the 18th and the 115th Regimental Combat Teams. They couldn't land because, like I said, you know, the beach was shut down at around 0830, so a more likely report would have been something like, you know, hey, the first and second waves have hit the beach, beachmasters declared the beach closed, and then trying to figure out what the hell to do next and what's going on the beach because there weren't a lot of radios working on the beach. Third wave troops didn't land until like 1100 and around noon, and by that point the Americans had already started to get off the beach and clear out German resistance.
That thing still working?
Yes, sir. Now and then.
Anything from the other beaches?
Nothing directly. A little while ago, the sergeant picked up some flashes from the destroyers.
Oh?
The 4th Division is off Utah Beach. They're moving inland.
Inland? What about the 1st Division?
They're hung up, sir. Like we are.
So I think they mentioned the 4th ID here as a way to kind of tie all the events together that are being shown in the movie, but in reality, like Norman Coda here, he wouldn't give a shit about the 4th ID. I mean, they're basically concerned about just what's going on with their men on Omaha Beach. I mean, Pointe du Hoc, yeah, they'd probably care about that because, you know, Pointe du Hoc was in the Omaha sector, and then the Rangers of C Company who were on Charlie's sector, their whole job was to link up with Pointe du Hoc. So, yeah, they'd probably care about that. But, I mean, you know, Utah Beach, that might as well be on the moon for these guys. And although we don't see them, there is a mention of the 1st Infantry Division right here where Coda asks about them, and he would have cared about that. So it's kind of nice that they get a little mention there.
What do you think?
Think?
We must have close to 1,000 casualties up to now. You want me to get word off the ships, have them come in, start picking us up?
You really think it's that bad, huh?
Put that helmet back on.
We can't get up this hill. We're hung up on it.
These are our men, Tom. You think we brought them in here to let part of them die and ask the rest of them to turn tail? Hell no, we're not leaving. We're gonna get up
You better
that
put
hill.
that helmet back on if you plan on doing
Somebody
that.
who can speak with the Rangers.
Yes, sir.
Now look, back down the beach here on the right, there's a gully.
Yeah, with a heavily defended concrete roadblock 20 feet thick, machine gun nests on both sides.
But if we can bow our way through that
We
road...
did it 3 times. We didn't get close to
I
it.
know 3 times are not enough. We're gonna hit it again. Can you find me some engineers?
We're all around you.
I mean engineers with equipment still working.
You gonna put that helmet back on now? There we go. Sorry, but yeah, that's a trope we see in a lot of these movies back then. You know, while he's conversing with Colonel Not Canham, Tom, as his name is in the movie, he just takes his helmet off and leaves it off for the whole conversation. It's like, put your helmet back on, man. We see that in a lot of war movies, but yeah, no, that's not going to happen. Unless he completely, like, loses it or, you know, had to quickly adjust something. He's not taking that helmet off in combat. So obviously a big chunk of the movie doesn't focus on Omaha Beach, so when we do finally cut back to it here to have the big climax, it's like they've been stuck on Omaha Beach for 5-6 hours at this point, and now finally Coda is just like, well, let's get organized and get off this damn beach. Like, what have you been doing for the past 5 hours, Coda? You know, just sitting there watching the carnage happen? Again, the real Coda and Canham hit Dog White sector around 0730, after a lot of carnage had already happened. LCVP-71 actually got caught up on a Minenfeld post and couldn't go any farther. Around this time, right next to Coda, LCI-91 was pulling back and set off a Minenfeld obstacle on its port side. The damaged craft pulled back due to the gunfire and made another approach about 100 yards east. The exact cause has never been confirmed, but from my own research, I believe the 88mm Pak 4341 inside the R677 casemate of WN-72 was responsible for nailing LCI 91's front starboard side during its second approach. Which killed everyone in the number 1 compartment and a number of soldiers and sailors that were on the deck. After this happened, Coda and his cadre finally reached the wooden seawall on Dog White sector, and immediately went to work putting units together and finding ways to get off the beach.
Now listen to me, all of you. You guys gotta snap out of it. We're getting off of here, we're going inland.
What about weapons, General? Most of my men lost everything they had. They're not afraid to fight, but they gotta have something to fight with.
Strip the dead and the wounded. Pick up anything that'll shoot. I don't have to tell you the score, you all know it. Only 2 kinds of people are gonna stay on this beach. Those that are already dead and those that are gonna die. Now get off your butts. You guys are the fight 29.
This guy's just standing back there. I'll just walk along the beach. Okay, so it might seem a little bit Hollywoodish at first, but all the testimonies regarding Coda said that he was standing upright like that, walking along the beach. You know, a lot of the testimonies also state that at the time it seemed like a pretty foolish thing to do, pretty stupid, and there's also an account that his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Jack Shea, was like yanking at his jacket to try to get him to get down. He was also panicking. All of the witnesses say that he walked upright like that, you know, to inspire the men, which did work. But yeah, a very dangerous thing to do, you know. I mean, if he hadn't been so lucky, he actually had been killed while doing that. It probably would have been remembered more as a cautionary tale rather than one of badassery. But yes, regarding all the testimonies with Coda, they all do align and say that he was just walking upright like that while giving orders. The lieutenant, though, who comes up and talks to Coda right here, is a bit of a different story. There were a couple officers who did come up from the seawall to talk to Coda, and these would have been guys from C Company of the 5th Ranger Battalion. If we go back to my little map animation here, it was around 0800 when Coda had already placed a BAR team just beyond the seawall to provide covering fire. Right after this, Coda met up with Captain John Rayan of the 5th Rangers HQ Company, who then pointed Coda to Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, who was the commander of Force C of the 5th Ranger Battalion. That's where Coda said to Schneider that the, quote, Rangers need to lead the way. In both cases, both of these men returned for cover after talking with Coda. But in the movie, the guy just stands there in the background for the rest of the scene. It's like, get down, idiot! What are you doing? And then, of course, you know, famously, we get the line, there are 2 kinds of people on this beach. Those who are dead and those who are going to die. Which is a quote that's attributed to General George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division, not Coda. Now, there are a number of testimonies that describe different things that Norman Coda said while he was on Omaha Beach, such as Rangers lead the way. But the most famous Norman Coda quote is, "We are being killed on the beach. Let us go inland and be killed." However, the origins of this specific quote are a bit nebulous. Jack Shea's detailed account of what all happened on Omaha Beach with Norman Coda doesn't mention Coda saying anything at this stage. The very first source of this quote actually comes from Cornelius Ryan's notes that he took while he was interviewing Coda in 1958. And if we're looking at it right here, the 8th line down says, quote, "To a group of Rangers, C Company of 2nd Ranger Battalion, we're getting murdered down here, let's get murdered up there." Right away, it was not Company C of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. They were already attacking WN-73 from the west after scaling the cliffs on Charlie sector. It was Company C of the 5th Ranger Battalion on Dog White sector. But the really weird thing is that Cornelius Ryan noted this in his interview with Coda, but for some reason, in the Longest Day book, Colonel Canham is the one who says this line, not Coda. And I don't know why that's the case, but other than Cornelius Ryan's book, I haven't found any famous quotes attributed to Colonel Canham, or any quotes at all for that matter, attributed to Canham. The brief conversation that Captain John Rayan of the 5th Rangers had with Coda while they were on Dog White Sector was first published in Joe Balkowski's book Omaha Beach in 2004, but then John Rayan himself later wrote a much more detailed account of that conversation in a 2018 witness statement. Neither John Rayan's own witness statement nor Joe Balkowski's book mention anything about John Rayan hearing "Let's move inland and be killed," so I don't think Coda said that to him. But there are some sources that lead me to believe that he might have said it to Colonel Max Schneider of the 5th Ranger Battalion. Going back to Joe Balkowski's book, Omaha Beach, if we go to page 197, John Rayan said that once Coda met up with Colonel Max Schneider, he said to him, "Colonel, you are going to have to lead the way. We are bogged down. We've got to get these men off this goddamn beach." Now, there is some similarity there to the quote about "let's move inland and be killed." Now, another testimony, this one by PFC Randall Ching of the 5th Rangers, says the following, quote, "I remember General Coda on Omaha Beach. When he met with the battalion commander, Coda said, 'Colonel, we are getting slaughtered on the beach. You Rangers gotta lead the way. Get off the beach.'" End quote. And then later in the same testimony, he says this, "Another thing, quote, another thing that Captain George Whittington of B Company said was, 'All right, you Rangers, you're gonna die. You don't want to die on the beach. You want to die inland.'" End quote on the whole thing. So those statements, along with Cornelius Ryan's notes from 1958, lead me to believe that at some point Coda probably said something along those lines. You know, I don't believe that he was out here like giving this big speech and he said, "Let's go die inland and get killed." You know, I don't think that. I think that he probably said it while passing along more orders, and maybe other people who heard it repeated the same thing as a way to try and inspire people to get moving.
You guys engineers?
Yes, sir. 299.
Where are your officers? Who's in charge here?
Well, I guess I am, sir. None of our officers made it in.
What about your equipment? Those Bangalore torpedoes work?
Yes, sir. We'll make them work.
What's your name, Sergeant?
It's Fuller, sir. John H.
Well, you're Lieutenant Fuller from now on, whether you like it or not. Now, you send some of your men down to the foot of that gully with those Bangalore torpedoes, and you and the rest of the men follow me.
Yes, sir.
Fuller. That guy's made up. That guy's fictional. He's not based on anyone real. I also like, going back to the whole uniforms and gear thing, I like how his mess kit pouch for on his pack is just completely flat. Put something in there to make it look like they actually have something in them. But this scene is kind of where the history starts to get really screwed up, I would say. In this final scene, they take a few separate things that happened on Omaha Beach and combine them into one. Robert Mitchum here approaches this guy who is supposedly an engineer, and he says he's from the 299th. Well, the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion landed on the eastern side of Omaha Beach, not the western side, so members of that unit would never have crossed paths with Coda on Omaha Beach. Now, at this time of the battle, when Coda was walking up along the beach, along the seawall, giving orders and such, the only recorded time that he ever had any interaction with engineers was with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ploger of the 121st Engineer Combat Battalion. According to Ploger, Coda had told him to go find Bangalore torpedoes, but he wasn't able to do that. So the majority of the Bangalore torpedoes that were used for this job had just come from the wire teams that were all gathered along the seawall. You know, the wire teams were in every boat team that landed on Omaha Beach, not just the engineers.
I got a rifle, sir.
Well, good for you, son.
You know, I got to admit, I do like Robert Mitchum as Coda. You know, I like Robert Mitchum in everything I've seen him in. And the funny thing is, though, I know that Norman Coda didn't like Robert Mitchum playing him in the movie, I guess because of his lifestyle. But, you know, this line right here, "Good for you, son." That's not documented anywhere. But after reading everything about Coda, I could see him saying that. So, yeah, sure, why not?
My Rangers are ready, General.
Okay, Major, move them out. Captain, move them up. Move them up!
Oh, Tom, we're ready. Ready as we'll ever be.
Ready for what?
It'll work. It's got to work.
See, I don't get this part at all. You know, first, this is the only time that we get a mention of Coda working with the Rangers on Omaha Beach. Is this guy right here who comes up and says, "Yeah, we're ready," and then he's gone. That's the only time that we get mention of the Rangers. But yeah, he's like, "We're ready." He's like, "Okay, go." And then Eddie Albert here shows up, and he's like, "Yeah, we're ready." And he's like, "Okay, good." I mean, ready for what? I mean, ready to blow the wire? Ready to get men off the beach? What's even happening here? I don't understand.
We're getting murdered here. We might as well move inland and get murdered.
Yeah, see, that they gave the famous "let's move inland and be killed" line to Colonel Not Canham. I'd have no idea why Cornelius Ryan decided that that line was said by Canham, and then, you know, gave it to this character who's supposed to represent him.
You ready, Lieutenant?
Yes, sir, we're ready.
You're gonna blow that roadblock for me, son.
Okay.
When I give the word, everything pops at once, okay?
Yes, sir.
Right.
So again, we get this thing with stop this. We get this thing about we're ready again. I mean, once Coda had made it to the seawall and he was moving from man to man, position to position, guys were crossing that promenade road and placing Bangalores in the wire. It was happening on the fly like that as he was moving from position to position. It was not this big thing that, oh, let's all get prepared for this one thing and do it all at once. No, it was happening spontaneously. The size of that thing.
First thing we gotta do is blow a hole through that wire with the Bangalores. And if that works, we'll pack everything we got under that wall. All right, let's go!
So, yes, while Coda was getting things organized, like I said, guys were crossing the promenade road and placing Bangalore torpedoes in the wire. There's no road here. We just have the wire. But, yeah, guys were placing Bangalores to blow up that wire. Now, most abridged versions of the story just have one hole in the wire that was blown, but in reality, there were multiple spots in the wire that had been blown open. And again, I'm only talking about what Coda did on Dog White Sector. We're only focusing on the stuff that was going on around Coda. If we wanted to talk about every breach in barbed wire along the entire 5 miles of Omaha Beach, we would be here much longer. Nope. Look at that. He pulled it apart. The Bangalores, they came apart as he was running away with the wire. Someone would have to go back and reset that. Real Bangalore torpedoes, the sleeves that connected them, they had these clips on the inside that would snap when you put them into place, so that sort of thing wouldn't happen. Oops. What this guy is using here to set off these Bangalore torpedoes is called a 10-cap blasting machine. It's an electrical detonator. It has wires connected to it, and it blows up. And that could be used to set off Bangalore torpedoes, but for wire teams coming out of boats, in boat teams coming up along the beach, the standard way to set off Bangalore torpedoes was with a waxed M1 fuse. It's this little device that you stick in the back of a Bangalore torpedo, and it has this little handle on it. And you pull that handle, it lights a literal cannon fuse that burns for about 10 seconds, and then it blows up. And that's what we should be seeing here instead of the 10-cap blasting machine. We should see instead and put it in, go, and then just run back, rather than doing this whole thing with the wires. Oh. It's very nice that the Germans left that open for them. So now we get to the second part of this whole plan, by getting through the German lines here by blowing up this gigantic, as I called it, the gargantuan concrete wall here. And as I said earlier, this whole thing, this concrete wall, it's a complete fantasy. There was nothing like that along Omaha Beach. They're combining the breach in the wire that General Norman Cota did, and then the destruction of the anti-tank wall at the D1 beach exit at Vierville-sur-Mer. But in our Omaha Beach history, we have to backtrack a little bit because the blowing of the wire and then the destruction of the anti-tank wall were two separate things. So around 0830 in the morning, C Company of the 5th Rangers and C Company of the 116th Infantry made about 4 gaps in the wire along the seawall of Dog White sector. On the eastern end of the breakwaters, C Company Privates Ralph Hubbard and George Lucy made it through the gap but got cut down by machine gun fire. And the engineer getting gunned down in the movie is probably based on that. In order to urge everyone forward, Cota brazenly ran across the Promenade Road, through the gap in the wire, and jumped in some abandoned German trenches. Led by Cota, single files of troops slowly made their way across the marshy, high beach area until reaching a draw that led up the plateau. So, this was actually how guys on Dog White sector started to get off the beach and move up to attack the Germans. What about the destruction of this wall, though? Like, did Cota personally supervise the destruction of an anti-tank wall and then order everyone to rush through it like what's depicted in the movie? Well, Cornelius Ryan's book certainly alludes to this in a very vague description, and obviously the movie says that he did. But the answer is no. He did not. But sort of. So after a while of trying to figure out what to do next and encountering some small arms fire and artillery on the plateau, Cota and Canham and their mixed units made their way across a field to the road that led to Vierville-sur-Mer. It was around noon when they finally reached the town, and Canham decided to set up his CP near the Vierville church, while Cota and Jack Shea decided to make their way down the Vierville descent to the Dog 1 beach exit. While they were in Vierville, the U.S. destroyers McCook and Thompson, as well as the battleship USS Texas, were firing 5-inch salvos at the exit that was guarded by the German nests WN-71 and WN-72. And specifically 2 large concrete casemates housing anti-tank guns. The main obstruction of the Dog 1 exit to Vierville was a concrete and stone wall protruding off the side of a R677 casemate housing an 88mm PaK 4341. During this bombardment, the Hotel du Casino and the Lake Chimeras houses were destroyed. Around 1300 hours, an estimated 30 Germans came out from their shelters, waving a white flag to the destroyers. These Germans were evidently taken prisoner by soldiers of the 121st Engineer Combat Battalion on Dog Green sector of the beach. A line of concertina barbed wire crossing the promenade was either cut with wire cutters or blown with Bangalore torpedoes, allowing First Lieutenant John McAllister and Major Alan Olson of the 121st Engineers to make their way across the niche in the anti-tank wall and proceed towards Vierville. Halfway there, they met up with Cota and Shea. McAllister took the general down the descent, and as they neared the anti-tank wall, about 5 Germans from WN-71 came down through their tunnels to surrender. The Germans wanted them to tend to some of their wounded comrades who were up on the plateau, but Cota refused this and instead made them march through the niche in the anti-tank wall to make sure there were no anti-personnel mines. These Germans were also taken prisoner by the 121st Engineers. Now through the wall, Cota moved east along the Promenade Road, using the parked tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion for cover. Here, he met Colonel Lucius Chase of the 6th Engineer Special Brigade and asked if his men could destroy the anti-tank wall. Chase told the general that they had no TNT at all, so then Cota spotted an unmanned army bulldozer on the beach carrying multiple wooden cases of TNT and said, "Use that thing!" And then he took off. Soon, Cota reached another army bulldozer topped with TNT boxes and asked a nearby group of soldiers huddled together on the seawall, "Who's driving this thing?" Eventually, a red-headed soldier, thought to be Joseph Drago or Al Valenzo, it's not sure which, volunteered to drive the dozer to the Dog 1 exit. Coda continued east along the Promenade Road with Jack Shea to try linking up with the 1st Infantry Division on Easy Red Sector. Back at the anti-tank wall, more members of Company C of the 121st Engineers started to arrive, including the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ploger, who Coda saw earlier on Dog White Sector. They had no idea that Coda had just been through the area, so they started to form their own plan on how to destroy the wall. 3 men led by Sergeant Noel Dubé set out on a recon up through the wall and only saw a couple Germans moving atop the plateau of WN-71. When Dubé returned, the 2 bulldozers carrying TNT had arrived, and Ploger ordered everyone to start setting up the charges on the wall. One thing that should be noted is that the anti-tank wall at the Dog 1 exit is usually described in many books as 6 feet of reinforced concrete, and that is a gross exaggeration. The anti-tank wall at the Dog 1 exit actually was only about 2 to 3 feet thick, and part of it was cobblestone. It wasn't even, reinforced concrete. And the hastily built wall also had a big vertical crack down the center, which you can actually see in a recon photo that was taken on May 19th of 1944. In any case, Ploger didn't know whether or not the wall was reinforced, so he used as many TNT cases as possible. It was sometime between 1300 and 1400 hours when the wall was finally set to blow. Once everyone was sheltered, Sergeant Dubé ordered one of his men, Private John Olenek, to set off the charges with an electric detonator, the 10 cap type that we saw used in the movie. The massive explosion disintegrated the anti-tank wall, proving that it was not reinforced with steel bars. After this, the anti-tank pit in front of the wall was filled by one of the bulldozers, and by that evening, tanks of the 743rd could finally move off the beach. So thanks to Cornelius Rhine's book and this movie, a lot of people do think that Coda was there supervising the destruction of the anti-tank wall at the Dog 1 exit. And a lot of people do think that the Dog 1 beach exit is Coda's draw, where he charged up after getting off the beach. And that's not the case. He did come down from Vierville through the wall and did order guys there to destroy the wall. But he was long gone by the time it was actually done. Ploger was there and supervised the whole thing. And this was certainly not the end of the day for Coda, once they got off that beach. I mean, it was only the beginning. He was still going up and down the beach, moving from, Vierville to St. Laurent to Colville, establishing CPs. The first time off the beach was just the beginning for Coda. I guess now's the time to fight. What were you all doing? Oh no! Eddie Albert! What the hell, dude? This guy's coming over the sides. Okay, so yeah, of course, no. The destruction of the anti-tank wall, or the blowing up of the wire, both those events did not result in men charging off the beach, to finally win the day, as it were. It's ridiculous. Hey, I get it. They have to bring this whole thing to an epic, climactic, heroic ending, but it doesn't make any sense. I mean, all of a sudden there are like a million guys just charging over the hill like a swarm of ants, and suddenly there's no more German opposition. In this giant shot right here, where everyone is charging through this big opening in the wall, we see guys coming over the sides as well, not even going through the blown open entrance, just going over the sides. Like, if that was possible, why didn't they just do that in the first place? It doesn't make any sense. Poor old Eddie Albert had to die for no particular reason. Colonel Canham, the guy who Eddie Albert is apparently based on, he didn't die at Omaha Beach. He survived the entire war, actually, so I'm not sure. Maybe this was a big fuck you from Daryl Zanuck if Canham was threatening to sue Zanuck if they used his name. I have no idea. I will say, though, for an actor in his 50s, that was a pretty good stunt. So there is that.
Okay, run me up the hill, son.
So that final moment with Coda there, is this supposed to be like in the following days after D-Day, or is this like a couple hours later? I'm not sure, because on D-Day, Coda was bouncing from one CP to the next the entire day, you know, and it continued all the way up until June 7th. You know, there was still fighting on June 7th around Omaha Beach. There was a whole German counterattack around Vierville-sur-Mer. Despite what Cornelius Ryan might have written in his book and what he wrote for this movie, the day did not end with Coda nonchalantly hopping in a Jeep saying, "Run me up the hill, son." And there we have it! The very first film depiction ever of Omaha Beach from the 1962 movie, The Longest Day. You know, I do have to admit that because this is a war movie from 1962, I do feel like this is kind of low-hanging fruit. You know, like I said earlier, of course this is going to be inaccurate on many levels. Of course the violence isn't going to be nearly as realistic as other movies. Of course it's a product of its time. I understand all of that. And like I said, I do think this is a very good war film for 1962. But I also can't help noticing that this movie, just like Saving Private Ryan, which was made, you know, some 30 years after this, is responsible for many misconceptions about Omaha Beach history. So I do feel justified comparing this movie to the actual events of history, because in doing so, viewers can further understand the actual history of Omaha Beach, rather than following the myths. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of The Longest Day, and let me know how well you think the rest of the movie holds up in terms of actual history. And let me know what other kind of D-Day media I should take a look at. And as I said at the beginning, I'm actually planning to go to Normandy this year, so I've started my GoFundMe campaign to help make that happen. The link is in the description. Oh yeah, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.